There are some Sundays when I show up and I do the sermon that I worked on during the week because that seems like the good thing to do. And there are other Sundays where that is not the way things go. So as I went to bed last night after watching the horrific news yesterday of the failed assassination attempt on President Trump, suddenly the text felt a little different, and it felt like today required maybe a different word than I had been thinking I would give earlier in the week. Coupled with this just glorious gospel reading that we have of the beheading of John the Baptist, it also dovetails a little bit with the reading that I've been doing recently. I enjoy reading history. I enjoy reading U.S. history. There's a relatively new book out by one of my favorite authors, Eric Larson. It's entitled The Demon of Unrest. It came out just a couple months back. And it is the history of just immediately prior to the 1860 presidential election of Abraham Lincoln through the initial assault on Fort Sumter in Charleston and the first shots of the Civil War and the demon of unrest that brought everyone to that place. I think as I've been reflecting over the last several hours, day of news and various things, there's a quick thought of, how did we get to this place? We're in this horrible place, and things are worse than they've ever been. Just having read a book on the Civil War, they can get worse, as I have read looking at history. In fact, sometimes it's hard to look at a broader swath of history because we personally only have so many years of personal focus, right? Such that it's difficult to see kind of outside of that context. I know growing up in the 1970s, there was this kind of period of time, kind of the Second World War through the early 70s, where at least if you were white and straight and a man in the United States, there was this one certain arc of things. But if we look at the history of the United States and even before the United States, that's the weird period of time. That's the strange period of time. The time outside of that is one of tension and conflict and factions and various things. But we don't have the corner on this market. I don't know if in the United States maybe we would be a medal winner in violent societies. But throughout history, there have been a lot of different societies and cultures that have been vying for a medal in that event. We have a violent history as human beings. There is chapter after chapter after chapter all over the world. We think of times in history that make the history books, and then other periods of time that don't, and yet have tragic stories in and of themselves. We look at the text that we have for today, and it is this bizarre singular story. And yet it's not at all singular, is it? Some man, it's often a man, right? Some man gets his ego up, offers and promises something and can't back down in front of his friends. So he gives an order. There's always somebody willing to give an order, right? And then there's a man who goes and does the thing. There's never been a shortage of people throughout all of history in any society who have been willing to then go and do the thing. We can all think of stories. Sure, I'll go do that thing. Why? Why as human beings are we like that? We think of John the Baptist here, his head brought up on a platter as a gift, every young girl's dream, I suppose, as we have from the text here, this horrible, horrible story. And yet, we're kind of insulated in modern times TikTok keeps us looking at the shiny thing, right? So that we're not focused in on the hard stories of this life. I want to shift a little bit. Preacher's privilege when you have a text that's not working with you. If we think of the gospel texts, and we think in particular of the stories that come at the very end of the gospels, every one of the gospels ends with the same story, right? Jesus being taken to a cross on a hill immediately outside of Jerusalem to be crucified, to be executed by the state. Now, crucifixion is one of the most miserable ways that one can die. The Romans, they would definitely be in the running for a medal in most violent of societies. But if you think of this image of what we are capable of doing to one another, sometimes we might read the stories of the Gospels and get our kind of theological hats on and think, well, what did I do? I'm a pretty nice person. What did I do that Jesus died for me? What's that all about? But all we have to do is read the other characters in that narrative. The one who gave the order. The ones who went and did the thing. Whipped him, bound him, put the crown of thorns on him, dragged him out, nailed his wrists and feet to the cross. What are we capable of doing to one another? That is what Christ died to call and save us from. The brokenness of humankind that so easily lashes out in violence. Many years ago now, there was somebody who was doing a study on primates, yes, us too, and was studying in particular why the hand shapes are so different amongst primates. And one of the things that was noticed was that the shape of the human hand allowed for a fist that was perfectly suited for striking. How many tens of thousands of years does it take to develop such a skilled capacity to strike? When we talk about original sin in the life of the church, when we talk about the brokenness that we have, there is an element to us that this is in our very DNA. And when we are employed, when our family is healthy, when things are good and things aren't horrible, it seems unimaginable that these things might happen. But it doesn't take too many extra variables. The loss of employment, the destruction of relationships that are close to us, hunger, any number of things that suddenly pushes human beings that otherwise might just be like us sitting in the pews this morning to acts that are unimaginable. Us, we. When we look at the text that we have for today, one of the things that is kind of interesting is the story of how John the Baptist's disciples, he had his own disciples, were starting to work with Jesus' disciples in the sense that there might be some hope going forward. Now, the important part of the story of the gospel, because as human beings, because of who we are, how does this story go? Jesus is born in kind of a rough and tumble scenario in the little town of Bethlehem, and he has a hard time at school, and things don't go well. But then in his early 30s, he gets a little, scrappy band of followers, and then he beats up the Romans and kicks them out, right? There's a heroic scene, sword overhead. Those are the stories we like, right? Those are the stories we like. The ones with violence towards those who deserve violence. But that's not how the story goes, is it? The story is about turning the other cheek. The story is about lifting up our neighbors, even when they are different from us in the way in which they speak, the way in which they live, where they are from, or if, God forbid, they vote for a different political party. Even then, we are called to lift them up. The idea that we are to be actively engaged in promoting life all around us, not the tearing down, not the diminishing of life, not the stealers of hope, but rather the ones who give hope to those who so desperately need it. Are we in a unique time in society in this life? Feels like it in my vast 54 years of experience. But if I widen my gaze a little bit, we human beings tend to find ourselves in these kinds of difficult times often. And the example that we have, the leader of our faith, is the one who calls us not to approach life with a closed fist, but with open hands, that we might bring love and hope and not death and destruction. Amen. Please stand as you are able.